This is part 1 of a 3-part series. This video will contain colossal spoilers for Attack on Titan. Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher active in the late 19th century. He was, and remains, a sort of wild card in his field because of his controversial ideas. This image was only further cemented by his work being misappropriated from extremists in all sides of the political spectrum. He was primarily concerned with morality and how the loss of religion in society would force people to reevaluate their morality for themselves. Good and evil, he also claimed, are a foundational part of the constant war over power dynamics that underlies all societies. As you know from having clicked on this video, Attack on Titan leans heavily into many Nietzschean concepts. Whether each example is intentional is another question altogether, but I digress. There have been plenty of videos in the past on this topic, that is, applying Nietzschean philosophy to this anime, but I find that these videos usually tend to focus on the same examples and are often filled with wildly inaccurate interpretations of Nietzsche's work. In this series, I hope to clarify some of the mistakes often made on the subject and explore some examples and topics that I haven't seen discussed. With that out of the way, let's begin. Whether we like to admit it or not, the fact is this: to rise above monsters, we have to abandon our humanity. Erwin says this in The Forest to justify the human cost of capturing the female Titan. He believes at this point that Erwin is a good leader because he's willing to make difficult decisions and sacrifice a few for the greater good. What I find interesting is the choice to describe him using the term monster. In his book Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche famously wrote, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And when you look long into an abyss, the abyss also looks into you." The lesson here being that when up against an enemy you consider evil, don't allow yourself to be corrupted by their ways. Don't become the very thing you hated so much.
Until now you have become the very thing you swore to destroy.
An example of this trope from another piece of media is Psycho Mantis from Metal Gear. As an FBI agent, he would read the minds of criminals, but eventually went insane after experiencing so much corruption for himself. So while Nietzsche might say that Erwin has stared at the abyss for too long, Erwin is saying here that it's a necessary evil. And to be fair to Erwin, I purposefully took him slightly out of context. His statement was a commentary on utilitarianism, the belief that one has a moral duty to maximize happiness, meaning that sometimes people must choose between the prosperity of one group or a larger group. Under this view, it might seem as though Erwin is making the choice between the lives of a few soldiers and the lives of all civilians. Nietzsche was also critical of utilitarianism, not because it sometimes requires inhumane choices, but instead because it's too focused on the happiness of the collective and not on the happiness of the individual. One might argue that since Erwin later sides against Eren, he doesn't truly become a monster. Erwin had his own motives for behaving as he did, so it's hard to say if it's even possible for him to stoop down, so to speak. There is, however, one character who gazed at the abyss for far too long. Flock was introduced as a naive member of the Scouts. He was the sole survivor of the charge against the Beast Titan during the battle to reclaim Shiganshina. While pleading with Levi to save Erwin instead of Erwin, he uses the very same argument that Erwin had made back in Season 1. He believed they needed someone like Erwin to make the unethical decisions. Although Erwin's stance changed, this was not the case for Flock. After Eren revealed his plan, he was fully on board with the rumbling and spearheaded the nationalist Jaegerist movement. Even despite his fall from grace, some might still argue that Flock's actions would be justified under Nietzschean philosophy. To determine whether this is true, we have to understand a fundamental element underlying Nietzsche's ideas: the dichotomy of master and slave morality. There are master morality and slave morality. The noble type of man experiences in itself as determining values. It does not need approval. It judges. What is harmful to me is harmful in itself. It knows itself to be that which first accords value to things. It is value creating. Everything it knows as part of itself, it honors. Such a morality is self-glorification. In the foreground, there is the feeling of fullness, of power that seeks to overflow, the happiness of high tension, the consciousness of wealth that would give and bestow. The noble human being, too, helps the unfortunate, but not, or almost not, from pity, but prompted more by an urge begotten by an excess of power. To put it simply, those who adhere to master morality are members of the higher class of aristocrats and must be noble in spirit. These noble men don't subscribe to the morality of the people they deem beneath them. The noble man's morality is based entirely on what is beneficial to his goals. He takes pride in his struggle for success and values his strength to make his will a reality. While he holds contempt for those who are too weak to embrace his lifestyle, this does not mean that he necessarily enjoys harming those beneath him. And if he chooses to help them, it's not because of a sense of duty or pity, but because it is a side effect of him striving for his goals. On the other hand, here's how Nietzsche describes slave morality. Suppose the violated, oppressed, suffering, unfree, who are uncertain of themselves and weary, moralize. What will their moral valuations have in common? Probably a pessimistic suspicion about the whole condition of man will find expression. Perhaps a condemnation of man along with his condition. The slave's eye is not favorable to the virtues of the powerful. He is skeptical and suspicious, subtly suspicious, of all the good that is honored there. He would like to persuade himself that even their happiness is not genuine. Conversely, those qualities which serve to ease existence for those who suffer, here pity, the complacent and obliging hand, the warm heart, patience, industry, humility, and friendliness are honored, for here these are the most useful and only means for enduring the pressure of existence. When a society is oppressed or enslaved by a group of masters, they might come to realize that they cannot fight off their oppressors through force. When this happens, they grow bitter, and society's view of morality changes dramatically. They realize they need to stick together, and instead place value on traits that will benefit the collective instead of the individual. This is so the individual does not sacrifice the collective for his own success. In the process of this shift in values, they also begin to demonize the traits of their oppressors. They say the qualities of master morality like nobility and self-aggrandizement are actually harmful. They claim to believe this because it won't lead you to real happiness, but deep down, they don't believe it themselves. In reality, they say this in hopes that their oppressors will adopt this morality and cease their activities. Only through this sort of deception can the oppressed level the playing field to enact their revenge, as now they're all equally doomed to a self-imposed mediocrity. This self-hatred and denial of noble qualities is what Nietzsche refers to as ressentiment. Now that we understand the difference between these two types of morality, I'd like to ask a question. Does Flock fall under master morality or slave morality? Take a moment to think about it if you must. It might be tempting to say master morality, but this is not the case. Yes, it's true that Flock and the Jaegerists are willing to go against the common morality that condemns the rumbling. Yes, it's also true that the Jaegerists are taking a militaristic approach instead of hoping that the Marlians suddenly decide to cease their imperialism. However, we must remember that the most important trait of master morality is a glorification of the self, i.e., individualism. Jaegerism is a nationalist movement unified under Erwin's cult of personality. To subscribe to a collectivist movement, one must devote himself to the state first and foremost. This is also why Flock adopts the slogan Shinzo o sasageyo.
Shinzo sasageyo! Shinzo sasageyo! Shinzo sasageyo! Shinzo sasageyo! Shinzo sasageyo!
Nationalist movements such as this require you strip yourself of your individuality for the good of the collective. Flock makes it clear that his goal is the security of the Eldian Empire first and foremost, meaning he cannot be adherent to master morality. So does this mean that Flock falls under slave morality? Well, not quite. It's true that he's a collectivist, but Jaegerists don't display any of the other traits of slave morality. They demonize Marley, but not Marley's militaristic tendencies, instead adopting those tendencies for their cause, since they acknowledge that they'll lead to their own success. They aren't partaking in ressentiment, nor do they promote traits like compassion, meekness, humility, and the like. So does Flock fit into either category at all? Before describing master and slave morality, Nietzsche first clarified this. I add immediately that in the higher and more mixed cultures, there also appear attempts at mediation between these two moralities, and yet more often, the interpretation and mutual understanding of both, and at times they occur directly alongside each other, even in the same human being within a single soul. From this we know that not every person or group is going to neatly fit into these categories, but instead, there's sure to be some overlap. One should also note that Nietzsche isn't making claims as to which system is inherently better. Both are valid for the goals they seek to achieve. He believed that morality is relative to the individual after all. He did, however, display a clear preference for master morality. His main issue with slave morality is that it devalues the individual and kills potential for personal growth for the sake of the collective. For this reason, I think Flock and the Jaegerists share more in common with slave morality than master morality, not because of what they believe, but instead because of why they promote those beliefs. So now you're probably wondering, what are some examples from the show that fit more neatly into each category? For master morality, we have Erwin. Unlike Flock, who was motivated by the collective, Erwin's goal was to prove the existence of civilization beyond the walls. He was willing to sacrifice his own men for this goal, and did so regularly. He was self-serving. You might argue that he also wanted to save humanity. Although this very well could have been a desire of his, he first and foremost wanted to find signs of humanity past the walls. This takes us back to the earlier passage of master morality. Nietzsche wrote that when noblemen help people, it's not because of pity for the weak, but instead prompted more by an urge begotten by an excess of power. It's a case where his noble self-serving goals also happen to align with the people's desire for freedom. Erwin has such a strong will that he's overflowing with power. This overflowing power allows him to accomplish deeds that help the weak as a mere side effect of his main objective. As a noble man, any choice to help people doesn't come from a feeling of social obligation, but instead a simple desire from within. This is also why, despite others repeatedly saying he had to become a devil, Erwin didn't actually stoop down to the level of the monsters he fights. Although he doesn't find any joy in the killing, he was willing to sacrifice his men and even civilians since the very beginning. He doesn't look down upon others, but still sees them as expendable. Thus, he never had to compromise his morality to beat the monsters in his path. I would compare Erwin to Napoleon Bonaparte, a figure who Nietzsche extensively praised. Both were charismatic military geniuses who single-handedly changed the course of history through their leadership. but their motivations were not just for the sake of their followers. First and foremost, they simply wanted to exert their wills to accomplish personal goals and secure their legacy by any means necessary. For this reason, I think Nietzsche would admire Erwin too, for he is the most noble character in Attack on Titan. Another example of master morality is the first ruler of the Eldian Empire, King Fritz. Nietzsche was fond of the ancient Greeks, as he believed that they did not concern themselves with the ideas of slave morality. They conquered their neighbors and valued strength and nobility. They would enslave their enemies despite knowing it was inhumane. This is because they didn't allow themselves to be swayed by pity or compassion. For more detail on this, read the first essay of On the Genealogy of Morals. Now, whether this perception of ancient Greek culture is true is already somewhat controversial, so I won't go into it. However, this characterization is in line with how King Fritz made the Eldian Empire into a superpower. In ancient times, things we now consider unpalatable like genocide and slavery were permissible during tribal warfare. King Fritz enslaved the neighboring tribes to expand his empire and even used Ymir as a weapon. Despite her being vital to his success and bearing his children, King Fritz didn't show an ounce of compassion to Ymir, leading to her death. Even past this moment, he's responsible for the continuation of Titan powers, as he forced his daughters to cannibalize Ymir's corpse so he could maintain his military dominance. Comparing the examples of Erwin and Fritz, we can see that there are both positive and negative ways to characterize master morality. It has its drawbacks just as slave morality does. Let us move on to an example of slave morality. Firstly, we have the treatment of Eldians in Marley and their indoctrination as warriors. This is comparable in some ways to real history. Nietzsche believed that some religions are made to promote slave morality. He uses Judaism and the rise of Christianity as his example. The Jewish people were oppressed by Romans and used their religion as a way to stick together. Jesus Christ later came along and took this to a whole new level, where he gives his own life for the sake of his faith. Nietzsche respected Jesus, but did not agree with the way Christianity turned out, as he saw it as the killer of master morality and its ideology of self-aggrandizement. To Nietzsche, the spread of Christianity was due to ressentiment, a spiritual revenge enacted by those too weak to fight back physically. This ressentiment spread among the Romans, who came to disavow their noble pagan traditions, and thus the Christians beat the Romans through cultural dominance. The validity of this historical analysis is once again up for debate, but that's not the point of this video. If we're to accept Nietzsche's claims for the sake of the argument, then it should be clear where these ideas appear in Attack on Titan. Marley was previously ruled over by the Eldian Empire. The empire eventually collapsed, but there were still countless Eldians living in Marley. The Marleyans were likely afraid of being overwhelmed by their numbers if they suddenly became pure Titans. They also needed to keep Eldians around to secure their power. So they instead decided to convince the Eldians that their own strengths were actually bad. They were called devils. They were told they had to repent for their past sins, and overall made to be ashamed of what made them so successful in the past. The master morality of the Eldians was wiped away through Marleyan ressentiment, and they became subservient to the Marleyans, who would be outmatched otherwise. When the scouts go to Marley and visit the subjects of Ymir Protection Group, the attendees denounce the sins of the islanders in hopes of being accepted by the Marleyans. We see Eldians truly consumed by ressentiment in this scene. Instead of stopping there, though, the Marleyans take things a step further. Traditionally, ressentiment just ends with the previous masters being doomed to mediocrity. This is supposed to be the slaves' final revenge. Marley, however, uses the enslaved Eldians as weapons of war. The important thing to remember about ressentiment is that if they themselves had the power, the slaves would be engaging in just as much oppression as the masters. Their hatred comes from envy. And so with the Titan powers they envied now in their hands, the Marleyans are free to cast upon their neighbors what the Eldian Empire had done to them. One more example of the slave revolt in morality is Karl Fritz and his successors. Karl Fritz ruled over the Eldians, but as Willy Tybur explains, he became compassionate to the Marleyans. He colluded with the Tyburs to fabricate a fake liberator, leading to a civil war that collapsed the empire and granted freedom to the lands they had occupied. He then sealed Paradis within the walls, bluffing that he would initiate the rumbling if the island ever came under attack. Fritz declared, "Eldians, Titans, they should never have existed in the first place. I will accept the responsibility of righting this wrong. Only, until the day that this retribution comes, I want to live inside the walls. I want to enjoy this brief paradise, this world without conflict." If one is to refer back to Nietzsche's example of the Romans, you can deduce that the exact moment Rome became a nation dominated by slave morality was when the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. From there, the religion's influence in society would only grow greater. Just as that was the moment master morality died in Roman society, Fritz's retreat to Paradis was the moment master morality died among Eldian society. Even more so when you consider it was forced upon them by Fritz wiping their memories. With that, I hope you've gained an understanding of master and slave morality. There are many more Nietzschean elements of this anime to analyze, but we'll save that for the next part. Do you agree with my assessments? Are there any other examples you can think of? Let me know in the comments and make sure to tune in for part 2. Catch you in the next one.